What are some of the most common issues when it comes to ADA compliance?
We actually had a realtor that we spoke to at one point who was looking at houses for us, who said, hey, it's only one step. One step is all it takes to keep somebody from a wheelchair from getting inside.
25% of the population needs housing that is accessible. They deserve a high standard of living, just like anyone else does, right? We should be able to help provide that. Joining us today is Frank Yeager of Yeagers Consulting.
Yeagers Consulting is a company that helps property managers, property owners with accessibility. We also help people with aging in place initiatives, as well as like people who have short and long-term disabilities, determine what modifications they may need in order to continue to stay in their homes.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Beyond Rent. Joining us today is Frank Yeager of Yeagers Consulting, and we're going to delve into the topic of accessibility. Frank will be sharing his insights and strategies to provide a safe and welcoming environment. Frank, welcome to Beyond Rent.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, glad you are joining us for this topic. This isn't something I think about in my day-to-day life, but I know for many, accessibility is something they think about constantly. It's always on their mind because it impacts how they get around, how they live, how they work. So this is a really, really important topic. So as we jump into this, let's go and take a moment and introduce yourself. Let us know who you are and what you do there at Yeagers Consulting.
Yeagers Consulting is a company that helps property managers, property owners with accessibility. We also can help advise as far as code and maintenance and so forth. We also help people with aging in place initiatives, as well as like people who have short and long-term disabilities, determine what modifications they may need in order to continue to stay in their homes.
That's great. That's definitely a need. And it's one of those things, once you need it, you really need a good solution. You need the right solution to ensure your quality of life can maintain as high as possible. So how long have you been working in this space?
I've been involved with disability. In about 17 years ago, I married the woman who's now my wife, and she is a finance professional, who also happens to be a C5-6 quadriplegic. And I've been a contractor for over 30 years. I've been involved with property inspection, a lot of different facets of construction. And believe me when I say I had no idea what the whole disability accessibility thing was all about. And it was like blinders were removed, because now I have to start accounting for, can she get in there? Can she actually get in and enjoy the venue wherever we happen to be going? So, I mean, it's definitely made me more aware of the way the built environment is and what's going on and what barriers exist.
Yeah, and I always love to hear how people get started with certain career paths or projects, because the reality is a lot of times it is this joining of multiple things. Like you said, you had an experience with being a contractor, and now your personal life had brought something in to your view that maybe you hadn't really thought about in your professional career as much, but you had the experience, you had the knowledge to really take and learn and provide this service to people that really needed it.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting. It's for sure. Statistically, around a quarter of the population is disabled in some way. So just being aware of what barriers and so forth are out there, I mean, helps everybody, whether you be in property management, whether you be, even a homeowner, and inviting someone to your home. I mean, it was challenging early on whenever my parents, they wanted to have my wife over to dinner. Well, there was a little bit of logistics that had to happen in order to make that happen. But I mean, it's something that helps everyone to develop a little bit of awareness of.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's go and kind of transition into the actual topic and think about this. So, why is accessibility such an important topic for those in property management to focus on, right? There's lots of things happening in property management, lots of hats that these people wear when they own or operate a property. But why accessibility? Why is that such an important topic for them?
Well, for a couple of obvious reasons and a couple of less obvious reasons. The obvious reasons are, you know, ADA is a civil rights law. So civil rights, I mean, ADA is something that people who own property in general, you're talking about, I mean, your particular audience may be entities that own property. So they need to be aware of what regulations exist. And the ADA is focused, unlike fair housing, which you can gets really, really muddy depending on where you are. ADA is focused on the built environment. So it is slopes, parking, entrances, and doorways, lighting, those types of things that allow a person to be able to access a property more easily. Property managers can benefit in a lot of ways just from opening up their properties to the disabled. Because in general, if you think about it, all of us tend to be this way. When we find someplace we're really comfortable with, we have a tendency to stay there. So you're dealing with people, I mean, like my wife, who is a finance professional and who did very well, to people who are on fixed income, Medicare, and so forth, who have fixed incomes and but it's also reliable income. So you may have you can have a longer term tenant. There's also again, yeah, there's ROI considerations as well. I mean, a lot of the modifications and so forth that you are going to do as a property owner can be defrayed by tax incentives and other strategies.
Yeah, and you had talked about the ADA, and ADA is something I think a lot of people are aware of. We hear that acronym, we know what it stands for, but in many ways, I don't think we know how it's applied and where it's applied. And I have a lot of questions on ADA. So I'd imagine just like any regulation or anything that's out there, ADA probably has changed over the years. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it was passed initially, I think in 1991. It was when the final version of it was passed. But it underwent a change in 2010 because the internet was more prevalent at that point, and so the Web3. I mean, a lot of people were familiar with screen readers and all the things that you have to do now if you have an online presence. But the built environment is actually sort of taken a back seat to the electronics environment.
That's interesting that, I guess we focus a lot on technology, but that built environment, the environment we interact with still seems really, really relevant. So not only has ADA changed maybe a little bit over time, how does that impact buildings that were built at different stages in history? And what I mean by that is, a building that was maybe constructed prior to ADA being in place versus something that's new construction versus new remodeling. Are all of those factors in how ADA applies, or does ADA apply regardless and you have to make the building fit ADA?
So ADA is a federal civil rights law. The enforcement of ADA is directed toward the Justice Department, and they have to be notified or have to find out in some way that a building does not adhere to ADA requirements. That being said, older buildings, I hear a lot of people say there's a misconception that, hey, I have an older building and it's going to cost too much to modify it, so I don't have to do it. The fact of the matter is that's not the case. You have to have some type of plan in place for barrier removal. That's what the law says. So, developing some type of a written plan is important, because that way you have proof that if somebody sues you for an ADA violation, you actually have proof. Hey, I'm doing the right thing. I'm working in the right direction. I'm trying to make my property more accessible. And there are certain aspects you're not going to be able to change without major structural changes, and those you don't have to necessarily address. there's provision in the law to allow for, hey, this is going to require a major structural change, and it's going to cost a ridiculous amount of money. So it's not. So there's really they don't force you to make that change.
Does that apply to, I would say, all types of properties, whether it be a commercial property or a rental property like an apartment or a home?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, people who rent single family units often, kind of ignore that, saying, "Hey, I mean, I don't really have to do it," but it actually may benefit a lot of people in some. I mean, if you have, let's just say, beachfront properties, you have short term rentals, that type of thing. If you have like one or two units that you transition into an accessible unit, now, I mean, somebody like my wife and I, we are constantly having to look for accommodations in places, and I mean, and having those places may benefit because you open it up to a significant. I mean, because just because it's accessible doesn't mean it's not usable by everyone. It's actually usable to more people.
That's something to think about, right? As far as your addressable market, if it is not ADA compliant, if it's not accessible, I think you said 25%. That's a right. That's a higher percent than I was aware of. That may or may not be able to use that property based on, I'd imagine, their limitations, right? So when we think about ADA, what types of disabilities are, I would say, covered or considered within ADA?
ADA actually covers blindness, deafness, mobility issues. I mean, which covers the vast majority of them. So the things like the visibility of signs for someone who has reduced vision, up to tactile aids for the people who are completely blind, visual aids for people who are deaf, as well as door widths, ramps, and so forth for people who use walkers or who use scooters or who use wheelchairs.
Okay, now that's really helpful. And you had mentioned earlier the fair housing standards versus ADA. Obviously, fair housing is really important in our industry. People think about that a lot, especially with how we speak to those that are interested in a potential unit, the process that people go through in applying. At what point through what I would say is more of like a prospecting application process, does ADA normally come up, and is that like a matter? So if somebody has a disability, are they making people aware of that right away during the application process? Or is it normally when somebody comes to view the property for the first time that they're learning how accessible that space is?
Quite likely, I mean, it doesn't benefit a person who is either in a wheelchair or in some other way disabled to hide the fact. Um, it's better to know right out of the gate whether the person that you're talking to has units that are going to meet your needs. So there's no real reason to beat around the bush, and there's actually no prohibition against asking. Um, if you notice questions or so forth that they're asking about, what's the parking situation like for where's the handicap parking at? How do you have for single family units, do you have first floor masters? A first floor master is a very important thing for people who are in a wheelchair, as well as en suites, not having to go to the second floor or another floor in order to use the bathroom, use showers and so forth. So there's really it's beneficial to both parties to get to know in advance what the physical disability would be, and if there is any.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And when I think of, an apartment building or even single family rentals, again, I don't always come from the perspective of thinking about accessibility issues and things like that. But like you had said, if you can find ways to accommodate, you can reach a larger audience. So when people are looking at their properties, what are some of the most common issues, or maybe the areas that are most commonly overlooked when it comes to ADA compliance?
Most often, you'll find that one step is all it takes to keep somebody from a wheelchair from getting inside. You know, I've heard we actually had a realtor that we spoke to at one point who was looking at houses for us, who said, "Hey, it's only one step. That one step makes all the difference." because, you know, a ramp has to be built if possible. Anything, something has to be done to overcome that step. But less obvious things are things like using solid surface flooring as opposed to carpeting. You know, wheelchairs, especially power wheelchairs, are brutal on carpeting as far as they have to turn, twist, things like that, and so it'll stretch it and cause issues in that regard, as well as sometimes it. I mean, if they're in a manual wheelchair, it makes it more difficult for them to push. So, and area rugs, people put area rugs in short-term rentals or in rental properties often, and those are going to tangle up in a caster or cause or create a trip hazard. I mean, a person who has any type of mobility issue, be that a walker, be that if they're blind, you have an area rug, any transitions that stick up above like the regular floor level, you just have to be really aware of elevation changes and things like that so that you don't cause people issues.
Yeah, that one step mentality in that little story you told about the realtor, that's really telling because, again, for those that just don't have that perspective, that lack that perspective, it's just one step, right? That was kind of the phrasing. It's just one step, where one step is a mountain in some situations, and understanding that and speaking to people in a way that shows some empathy and some compassion and some understanding, I think probably goes a long way too. That one step means there has to be work done to make that a livable space, especially a long-term livable space.
Sure. Well, I mean, for instance, 60s and 70s were great for the sunken living room. I mean, this you see the sunken living room all over the place, and a sunken living room makes it just no deal for us because it's not possible for her to access it. So you definitely have to make some changes to that area.
Yeah, and when I think about popular designs, it is interesting that you brought up like the sunken living room and different I guess design choices that we've made over the years. The more modern idea of like an open floor plan is actually probably very helpful. So maybe more modern builds, whether it be single family homes or even apartment buildings, are tending to be a little more open. That sounds like it's a pro when it comes to ADA.
Yeah, universal design is a concept that, I mean, has brought the built environment a long way toward better accessibility overall. It's not panacea by any means, but it helps to develop a mindset of these are the things we need to account for to allow a space to apply, have universal design apply. At the same time, it's always funny to me how many like small little things that just seem to be like mental blocks. Hey, you can't. For instance, I was in a house recently, and the basement access was at the end of the hallway, and there was no way so a wheelchair needs a certain area radius to be able to turn. ADA, for instance, at landings and so forth, requires 5 feet of turning space, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily take that much, but you still need some type of space to turn, and that space simply wasn't there. Or turning out of a hallway into a bedroom. If you have a difficulty, if there's not enough space, if the hallway isn't wide enough to make that turn, then it's an inaccessible space. It's a barrier. Um, you know, and again, the one step thing. I mean, it's amazing how often transitions and so forth create a situation where it's a trip hazard to a lot of people, and to a wheelchair, it's insurmountable.
Yeah, and I also think back the shag carpet era and things like that, where we've moved away, right? We're more hard surfaces now. But again, like you said, especially maybe short-term rental is a great example of this, because if it's a traditional apartment, someone's going to choose what type of carpet or not carpet, but rug they put down. But short-term rental, they're decorating these spaces, they're putting things in it. And when they're purchasing the furniture and the rugs and so forth, they need to have ADA in mind for those items as well.
Sure. Well, I mean, and a lot of people think, hey, they're in a wheelchair, they're going to have an aid or something of that nature, but that's not necessarily the case. Um, vehicles and are, I mean, my wife is able to drive. So if they have a vehicle that they can get around in, there's not necessarily someone there to help them. So you definitely want to try to make accommodations as much as possible to allow them to be able to utilize spaces independently.
That makes a lot of sense. So for people that are in property management and they're aware of ADA, they understand maybe a little bit of it, but when they look around at their company, around at their properties, they know they have some issues. What are some of, I guess, the early steps, the best practices as someone is evaluating a property or properties for ADA? Where should they start with that thought?
It seems common sense, but it's amazing how often it doesn't happen. Start from the outside. People, I mean, we've been in umpteen different places that have the most splendiferous accessible bathroom you ever saw in your entire life, and you can't get into place. So, if your doorways aren't wide enough, if your entrances aren't accessible, it's pointless to do modifications on the interior of the building. So focus on where's the parking, where are they going to be accessing the space from, how do they get inside, and then walk through the process of how you would use the space. How do I get in? How do I use it? And those are the areas you try to tend to focus on first. And that's where that plan comes in. If you can develop a plan, number one, it helps with budgeting. I mean, you can plan out what you're going to do and what you can afford. And because ADA doesn't require that you do everything at one time, you can actually budget money, and that counts. If you say, hey, I set aside $15,000 for this project, but it's going to cost me $25,000, so I'm not going to tackle it until next year, that's okay. They don't require you to go get a big loan and address all these things at the same time. So it also helps with, if you are able to write off by our IRS rules, you're actually able to write off up to $20,000 worth of ADA expenses. So, and that means people like me who help with consulting, engineering, and so forth. So, I mean, all those expenses apply, and you can write off $20,000 up to 20,000. And then if you happen to spend over that amount, you can actually take the overage and apply that to the basis of your building and depreciate it over time. So there, essentially, accessibility doesn't cost you anything at all.
Yeah, that's something I don't think most people are probably aware of, right? A few key things in there is, first of all, having a plan is actually the most important part, right? Creating the plan, having a plan, being able to communicate what your plan is, and then responsibly budget for it, knowing that there are tax incentives that truly our community, or however you want to look at our country, wants this to take place, and that there's things in place to make sure that you are able to do it without hindering the business overall. So how much of like your work is focused on that side of it, helping people understand that they can do tax write-offs, that they can look at depreciation and other ways to help make this affordable?
So in the Northeast, where the housing stock is more expensive and is older, it's more expensive to modify. We run into, it's kind of a back and forth. So these are the things that you're able to do to actually make sure that you're complying with the ADA, and this is how you pay for it. And when people realize that, essentially, when it's all said and done, I mean, and if you do cost seg, there's like, it's even better, because, hey, I needed to change my front door to an automatic door, a push button door, and it cost me, $7,000 to put that in, or $5,000 to put that in. You can write that off. I mean, there's just a lot of different, and those are just the federal incentives. If you check in your local jurisdiction, sometimes local jurisdictions tend to have their own incentives that they can apply as well. So state, locality, and so forth.
So it really tells me that there's education that needs to happen on many different levels. One of them is tied to all the incentives that are in place. I think when a lot of people think about ADA and so forth, they might think of, I would say, the negative side of it, meaning if they don't do something, they might be liable. They may have a lawsuit, things like that, which I'm sure can and do happen on a regular basis. But I think there's some fear built in there rather than this idea of maybe empowering yourself to make a positive change for your property and that there are tools and resources around you to help get it done.
Yeah, I mean, I recently, it was a department store, um, believe it or not, a very well known department store. We went in, went to use the elevator, and she was unable to access the elevator controls because they had put a couch in front of it. Sometimes, okay, now some people may very well say, hey, this is ridiculous. I'm not putting up with this. And they file a lawsuit. Next thing you know, the department store gets a notice, hey, we're being sued under the ADA. The simple fact of the matter is by moving that couch, they've eliminated the lawsuit. The lawsuit's dead. There's literally no basis for the lawsuit anymore. So doing small things that may not be so obvious, even if you need to get some advice on, hey, take a quick look through here, let me know if there's anything that stands out, then, you know, going ahead and just addressing those small things, that goes a long way toward helping people be able to use space better. And again, if a person in a wheelchair with limited mobility is able to use a space, it's more accessible to everybody. It's a more pleasing space to everybody because it's a more open, well lit space. It's just better all the way around.
And you said well lit. That is something I haven't thought about. Is lighting important with ADA?
Sure, because people with not everybody's completely blind. Some people just have vision impairment, and so proper lighting is incredibly important. There's also the standpoint of it. So property maintenance code and building codes require certain levels of lighting in a space. So I mean, one of the places I see it most often is in stairways. You'll see stairways that just aren't well enough lit, and this is also one of the more common areas where people get sued because it's like, you know, you're required to have a certain level of lighting so that people can see the space adequately. You need the handrails in place so that people can be stable, tread depth, riser heights, all these. There's a whole lot of variables that get involved whenever you start talking about these things.
Yeah, that's interesting. And like you said earlier, the idea of making these changes can be a benefit to everyone. Well-lit spaces are a benefit to everyone, right? Even if you do not have mobility issues, being able to see the stairs and feeling safe and secure at a property is really important too. And a lot of times lighting provides that, right? If it's well lit, you feel more secure. You can see your surroundings better. So it's a benefit to all those that are around.
Sure. I mean, a natural light is obviously better. It's more pleasing, but at the same time, it's not always possible either. So, I mean, there's provision in property maintenance code and in building codes to allow for light to travel from one room to another. So, you know, and what the requirements for that are. There's a whole there's a whole list of requirements and things that need to be addressed. But at the same time, it's something that some people like. I mean, a lot of engineers do this stuff all day, every day. So this is something that they know. Um, and people like me, people who work in the built environment are well aware of these things and can, I mean, and incidentally, I'm also trained in property maintenance and building code. So I have some knowledge in that regard, obviously.
Yeah, that helps a lot, right?
For sure.
So, if people aren't knowledgeable on ADA and things like this, what are some of the resources out there that they can help train their teams on so they can become more aware of what's out there, what needs to be done, and maybe start identifying the areas that maybe they're weak in?
Well, I mean, I actually have a checklist that's modified from the ADA that helps people address parking, entrances. It's taken in part from a couple of other resources that I kind of compiled together. But it enables people to be able to walk through the process of what an inspector would look at whenever they're looking at a space. But one of the biggest and easiest things to do is just drag your feet. If you trip over something, it's probably not a good thing and it probably needs to be addressed. If you noticed deteriorating spaces, those probably need to be addressed. I know a lot of times, even in cities, you'll see heaved sidewalks and stuff from tree roots. Those are things that need to be addressed. So, um, and because most of the time the property owner is responsible for the sidewalk area. So getting that addressed is really important, and it creates a better space for everybody. So, because you eliminate trip hazards and all that, which makes it safer for everybody.
Yeah, that's great that you have went out there and started compiling some of this content, this data, these checklists, because I think that's what most people really need, right? They need a place to start. They don't know all the details. They don't know all of the regulation around it. So their concern is, well, do I really understand what it looks like? And that little tip of just kind of shuffling your feet just a little bit, I'm sure that I'm sure a lot of people have used that. And that's a nice little technique to see, what it would feel like or what it would look like if I had some mobility issues, and looking at those one step type scenarios and how many of those exist on your property are all really important. And this idea of, you said earlier, starting on the outside of the building and working your way in and doing your best to put yourself in the shoes of someone else, right? To put yourself in the life of someone else that has mobility issues or maybe sight or hearing issues. What are those little areas that would become really challenging for those that are in our community, and making sure that we're open and available for them as well?
I mean, in a lot of places, you may not have your own dedicated parking. I know, like, if you're in the city, a lot of times you may not have your own dedicated parking. You may be reliant on street parking, and where curb cuts and all those types of things are. But there's nothing preventing you from installing an auxiliary curb cut in front of your building. I mean, that's one thing that can often help getting people into your property and making it more accessible. It's just something small, but it's possible to do. It's there. Again, sidewalks, you see a lot of times, like, some slabs may settle and create like a little bit of a difference in elevation between one slab and another. And that, I mean, if you have an umbrella stroller and you're pushing one along, and you feel bad for the kid that's inside it, you probably want to fix it, because a person who's pushing a wheelchair is definitely going to have a problem with that. Or grandma in her walker, pushing her walker along. I mean, it's got those little wheels on it, and it's going to catch on it.
Mm-hmm.
The back legs are just sliding along the ground. They're gonna catch on those types of things. Thresholds of doors. We were in a timeshare here, I think it was last year, that had standard residential threshold doors installed, and my wife was completely. I mean, it. She had to completely bounce over it. I mean, we're talking about a 4-inch difference in elevation. So coming from an outside veranda into a little area that had 2 entry doors, and she had to bounce over this big threshold. It was, they make low threshold doors. You don't need to have those doors in there. In fact, they're very, very common. Um, and in commercial applications, one of the things that drives me the craziest is those push button doors. You can get doors that are remote, so you actually don't even have to install a bunch of wire and stuff, unless you want to. You can actually install ones with remotes that are battery operated, but somebody is able to push that button and open that door. Think about moms with strollers. Think about people pushing a cart. Think about, I mean, all these different applications where it's not just people in wheelchairs, it's not people with walkers, but it's a whole variety of people that if they're able to push that button, they're able to walk right in. And most of those doors are not difficult to open manually either. So the average person is easily able to get in and out of your store or out of your space, and everybody else is able to as well.
Yeah, and I love this theme of what is good and compliant with ADA and helping those with disabilities really benefit everyone, right? I really love that theme. You had mentioned using the stroller example. If a stroller has a hard time on a sidewalk, so will a wheelchair. But the point is proven then, right? That so anyone pushing a stroller, anyone that has small children using strollers will benefit from an improved space, deliveries coming in and out of the property with that push button door, all of these little ways to improve the experience for everyone. It's not just this 25% of the population, but again, even if it was, it'd still be well worth it, but it does really impact everyone's quality of life that's on a property.
And specifically in the residential market, accessible housing is a severely underserved market. If you look at government statistics, in general, there's a housing shortage. For people who need accessible housing, it's utterly ridiculous. There are people who just simply have to make do with whatever they can find simply because they can't find accessible housing. So being a person who is a developer or a person who is a property manager or an owner who says, you know what, I'm going to dedicate, say 10% of my units to accessible housing. You're going to have people beating your door down. You're going to have a waiting list. It's just the way it is.
Yeah, it sounds like a smart business decision to me. So, Frank, if people want to learn more, if they want to get a hold of that checklist that you spoke of, or if they have questions on ADA, what's the best way for them to reach out and have a conversation with someone like your consulting company?
We have a website, is yeagersconsulting.com. And my email, you can just type in info at Yeagers Consulting and reach out, and I'm happy to send resources and answer questions and so on. Really try to be as accessible as possible. I'm also on LinkedIn. They can reach out on social media and reach out to me that way too.
That's great. And we'll drop some links into the show notes as well. If there's anything that you want to share there, definitely a link out to the website and so forth. Any last thoughts before we close out today as far as accessibility and the importance that it has here in the property management space?
One thing that we really haven't talked about yet is the importance of reaching out to your community. There's centers for independent living. There are health and human services departments in most areas. There are a lot of community-based resources to help people even navigate, hey, what is the biggest need in our area? Centers for independent living can help with, so they refer people to accessible housing and resources for home care and a wide variety of things. So those people, if you have accessible housing and you reach out to them and tell them so, they're actually, it's a community-based resource that doesn't cost you anything. It's the cheapest advertising you're going to get, that, hey, we have several places that have ADA or ADA compliant and that you can get into, and you'll have people, like I said, you'll have people on a waiting list just waiting to get in.
That's great. That's a great tip. And Frank, I really appreciate the type of work that you do. It is important. Like I said, 25% of the population needs housing that is accessible. Housing is important to everyone, and we shouldn't have to make do. I think that was a phrase you used earlier, make do with whatever they can find. They deserve a high standard of living, just like anyone else does, right? We should be able to help provide that for them. So I really appreciate what you do. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today. It's a very interesting and very important topic. So we appreciate all you do and the time that you made for us today. And I'm going to thank our audience as well for listening into another episode of Beyond Rent. And until next time, keep going Beyond Rent.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Beyond Rent. If you enjoyed this podcast, spread the word on social media and with your peers in the industry. To be notified when more episodes are released, subscribe using your favorite podcast player. Beyond Rent is brought to you by Rent Manager Property Management Software. Learn more about Rent Manager's industry-leading software solutions at rentmanager.com. Until next time, keep going Beyond Rent.